Hello, my name is Will Meshnig, and I'm a discussion group coordinator and a member of the Student Advisory Board here at the Dole Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program made possible by Newman's Own Foundation. Today's program will be live streamed and available on our YouTube afterward. For virtual viewers, please send your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. Please ask just one brief question. Of course, all of you in the audience will be able to ask your questions as well. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Also, if you have enjoyed this discussion group series, which I'm certain that you have, you will also enjoy the 2022 Dole Lecture, which will be held on April 14th at 7 p.m. Presented each spring, the lecture commemorates the date when Bob Dole was critically wounded while serving in Italy during World War II. The Dole Lecture honors Senator Dole's courageous recovery and continuing commitment to serve the nation. This year's special guest speakers are Walt Riker and Clarkson Hine. Riker and Hine both served as press secretary for Senator Bob Dole during his historic time in the U.S. Senate and on the presidential campaign trail. Riker and Hine will discuss the evolution of the media cycle, share their experiences, crafting partisan messaging, and reflecting on bipartisan leadership. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming this semester's Spring 2022 Dole Fellow, Bob Blaemire.
The Dole discussion groups are made possible by a grant from the Newman's Own Foundation and in partnership with the Howard H. Baker Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, and the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. And I ought to just take a moment to say that, for context, that this is April 6th, and just 2 nights ago, Kansas's basketball team became the national champions of the NCAA men's basketball. So, as a non-Kansan, I was on the right side, but nonetheless, it was a great game, and I congratulate everybody here who is a KU Jayhawks fan. Our speaker today, the person who's generously agreed to join me, is John Shaw of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. John grew up in Peoria, Illinois, and began his career as a governor's fellow in Springfield, Illinois, working in state government, and later participated in a training program with the European Union in Brussels before moving into journalism with a position at the Wall Street Journal, Europe. John worked as a reporter in Washington, D.C. for more than 25 years, covering Congress for Market News International, a global financial wire service, and the diplomatic community for the Washington Diplomat, a monthly magazine. John is the author of 5 books, and how I first got connected with John was when I was first beginning my research for the biography of Birch Bayh that I wrote, which circuitously got me here. I was in touch with John because he had written a biography of Senator Richard Luger of Indiana, Birch Bayh's colleague at the end of his career, but earlier in his career, he was his opponent for re-election. And in that campaign, I had the pleasure of traveling with Senator Bayh throughout the campaign when we defeated Senator Luger. So the Luger presence has always been very large in my life. Did a great interview with him for the book, but I knew him most before John, the period that John wrote about. So John has written a couple books on ambassador and in diplomats. He's written the biography of Senator Luger. He wrote about John Kennedy's Senate service, and then about the transition period, I guess I could describe it, between Eisenhower Kennedy. So let me introduce John Shaw. So John, why don't you give us a little idea of how you got here, and then share with us I know when you worked in the Hill, you had some experiences with Bob Dole, which our Kansas audience.
Well, maybe I will start with my impressions of Senator Dole, because I was a reporter, and I started covering Congress in 1991, a long, long time ago. And Bob Dole was a Senate Republican leader, and he was battling with the Senate Democratic leader, George Mitchell. And these were 2 formidable people, and it would be sort of like watching Kansas and North Carolina every day. I mean, these were 2 skilled legislators, tough, shrewd, strategic, friendly to each other, very civil, but also very strong partisans. You know, they were party leaders. And as a reporter, I remember covering Senator Dole in a couple contexts. One was during the budget battles of 95, 96, there was government shutdowns and all. And the hard thing about covering Senator Dole was that he was, you know, very, very funny, but it was a very deadpan, sarcastic sense of humor. And I remember at one point, you know, a bunch of reporters were gathered around Senator Dole, and, you know, they're battling the Clinton White House, and some reporters said, so, you know, are you going to surrender? And he said, oh yeah, we're just going to totally surrender. And he meant it totally sarcastically, completely. But then one of my colleagues ran out and filed a story, Dole, you know, Republicans to surrender to Clinton. So it got to the point when I would cover Senator Dole that the reporters would have to sort of, after he spoke, have kind of a meeting to decide. My microphone may have just dropped off there. Okay, but we had to sort of decide among ourselves, you know, kind of interpreting Senator Dole's remarks. You know, did he mean it sarcastically? Was he serious? But he was just such a formidable figure to watch. And one thing I remember a lot is I covered many of his speeches. And he would oftentimes speak, you'd have a tradition where various trade associations would have meetings in Washington, in the spring, and Dole would speak to these, legislative leaders would speak. And it was so interesting to see Senator Dole come into a room because people respected him so much. And he had this wonderful, he was a great speaker, wonderful self-deprecating humor. He would always kind of, you know, tell stories about himself. And it was a kind of a quality we don't see much in American politics, of people able to kind of make fun of themselves or to make light of their accomplishments. But it was just, I have just very vivid memories of Senator Dole entering a room and just seeing the respect that he commanded and just the way people reacted to him. So that was really striking. I don't know, do we need to do anything with the mic or should I? Sorry about that.
It was a sarcastic mic. It didn't have real meaning to me. We're just trying to make fun of you, John, is what it is.
But let me just tell you a little bit then about maybe the Luger book and how that...
Well, yeah, because I'm interested in all your books, but particularly about the Senate, saying this is about giants of the Senate, and I agree. I would say Richard Luger was one of the giants of the Senate while he was there, and he could have been there for a very long time.
But it's funny with book writing, and I think you'll find this in your careers, and just even projects generally, how projects connect and come together in ways you don't expect. So I wrote this book called The Ambassador, in which I chronicled an ambassador, Sweden's ambassador to the U.S., how he worked in Washington. And this guy was a rock star. And so I wrote this book on him, and I quoted Senator Luger, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, about the ambassador. And so, you know, Senator Luger had some interesting things to say. And then when the book was coming together, I asked Senator Luger if he would write a blurb for the book, you know, one of these little endorsements. And he was gracious, and he did so. But I have to say I had kind of a second strategy, which was as I was finishing up the Ambassador book, I thought, okay, I'd like to write a book about Senator Luger. And and I wanted to kind of get the book idea in front of him. So the Ambassador book came out. A couple months passed, I was promoting it, and then I started thinking, okay, I'd like to do this book on Senator Luger. So I approached his press person. I said, you know, I'd like to do this book. And I'll never forget the sequence, because it was like on a Monday, I sent him a note, and I said, I'd like to do this book on Senator Luger. And he got back to me the next day, and he says, well, you know, thank you, we'll review it. The next day, he called me up and said, Senator Luger would like to meet you on Friday in the Senate dining room, which I took to be an encouraging sign that he was not going to, you know, invite me to the Senate dining room to say I'm not interested. But it was so interesting, so I went to and I was prepared for this meeting because I assumed he was going to want to understand just what the parameters of this project was. So I went to the dining room, and Luger was there with about 4 of his top aides. And it was interesting because, you know, he asked me generally about the project, but then the others asked some really tough, hard questions about how much access would I need, how long would it take, you know, when did I expect the book to come out, whether I had a publisher, all these sort of tough questions. And I was prepared. I was not, I mean, they were fair questions to ask. So as our lunch was finishing, I said, well, Senator, let's maybe touch base in a week or two when you have a sense of if you want to go forward. Excuse me. And he said, no, I'm ready to go forward now. Let's do it. So we agreed. And let me just kind of briefly tell you, how do you write about a sitting senator? And it's challenging. It's interesting, it's fun, but it's also challenging. Interviews. I interviewed him about once a month for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Interviewed many other people about him, including, and I will say this story to the end, an interview with Joe Biden that was one of the most remarkable moments of my life professionally, but I'll get back to that later. So lots of interviews. Secondly, I traveled with Senator Luger some. I spent a week in Indiana traveling around with him, took a remarkable trip to Russia, Ukraine, and Albania with Senator Nunn and Senator Luger to look at this program that they had developed called the Nunn-Luger program. And particularly now—
That was about the nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah.
They're trying
the concept was that the U.S. would use taxpayer dollars to secure weapons in this former Soviet Union, which had unraveled. And it's even now it's so poignant because I remember in Ukraine, we took an inspection tour to this facility, and I was sitting next to this young Ukrainian diplomat who was an arms control expert, and just saying how grateful they were to the United States and Senator Luger in particular for having created this program. And as it happened, she was like, God, I would love to meet Senator Luger so much. And we were on the bus together, and he was up in the front. So as we're getting off the bus, I said, Senator, can I introduce you to someone? And so I introduced him to the young diplomat, and we talked for a few minutes. And as he was walking away, she said, he's a rock star in Ukraine.
But did you have Senate bean soup when you were at the restaurant?
I did. We had plenty of bean soup. That was.
Yeah, for those who haven't been around this, I actually had lunch in the senator's dining room once with Mick Fleetwood and John McVie from Fleetwood Mac. That's a whole different story. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
So I traveled, but the third piece was watching Senator Luger work in Washington, and this is where I think how fortunate I was, because I would watch him at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I had a desk in the Capitol, and when I'd oftentimes go to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and watch these meetings. But let me tell you who was on the committee. So Senator Luger was the top Republican, Joe Biden was the top Democrat, John Kerry was a senior Democrat who later became chairman of the committee and then Secretary of State. There was a junior senator by the name of Barack Obama who sat in the back and was trying to get, trying to get attention. Not attention, he was trying to get recognized. He was the most junior member of the committee. And sitting behind Joe Biden was his top staffer, a young gentleman by the name of Anthony Blinken. So as I pull back, it's like you had two future presidents, Obama and Biden, two future secretaries of state, Kerry and Blinken, and Richard Luger, who is probably one of the most significant foreign policy senators of our time. And it just, even as I was watching it, I mean, I didn't know what the future was going to bring, but it was just watching this really high-level legislating occur. Luger, very detail-oriented, very courtly, but very kind of relentless.
One of the very few Rhodes Scholars in the Senate.
That's right.
Yeah,
and Senator Biden, talkative, interesting, unscripted. Blinken was behind him at times trying to rein him in and all. And it was, and then Senator Obama would come in and ask really tough, incisive questions. So this is one of those times as a reporter you think, I should be paying money to do this. I should not be getting paid. It was just so remarkable to watch that work. And then the final piece of the interviewing was just reading. And Senator Luger's website was effectively a graduate course on international affairs. I mean, it was just filled with his speeches, with policy papers and white papers. And as someone trying to write a book, it was really, really hard because there was just so much information. It was almost, overkill. And so this was, a project. I had a full-time job covering Congress, but I'm also writing this book, and I'm trying to interview Senator Luger. I'm trying to travel with him. I'm watching him work as much as possible. I'm trying to read as much as I can. And so it was a real challenge, but the biggest challenge is Senator Luger's political fortunes shifted dramatically. Because when I started this project in 2006, Senator Luger was running unopposed for a Senate term. One of the two or three, maybe the only, I think there was maybe one other person who ran unopposed. So he was.
He was also the only senator from Indiana to ever exceed 3 elected terms. I know because my boss was going for a fourth
yeah.
when our careers ended.
That's right.
And Luger lasted longer than that.
So it was. So the thing was that Luger's career, he was, and the premise of this book was Luger is so strong at Indiana, he could work on foreign policy. And that was true for 34 of the 36 years he was in the Senate. Unfortunately for me, as I'm writing this book, his career is changing, and he is becoming more imperiled in Indiana. So I'm writing this book in 2010 and 11, and I'm realizing the basic premise I had, which was he was so strong in Indiana that he could work, on foreign policy issues, which not every senator or congressman can. I mean, the American public is ambivalent about how much we want our lawmakers to work on foreign policy issues. And so Senator Luger's, he was becoming weaker politically, even though he was doing amazing work in Congress. And so as I was writing this book, Bob and I had the same publisher, Indiana University Press. As I'm working on this book, I'm realizing that Senator Luger's prospects, are changing. And so I finished the book in 2011. It came out in 2012. And within a couple months of the book coming out, he was defeated in a primary. In fact, his opponent, the book was called Statesman of the Senate, and his opponent used that title against Luger. He says, we don't need a statesman. We basically need a tough Republican who will battle President Obama.
And this was the rise of the Tea Party.
That's right.
The Tea Party had just come up, and this was Richard Murdoch was a Tea Party candidate who opposed Luger.
So Senator Luger was kind of at the front, in fact, that was kind of the front edge of the Tea Party movement, in which establishment Republicans were challenged and in some cases defeated by an insurrectionist group in the party that was more focused, I think, on making points and kind of stirring up unrest than they were in governing, which was very different than Luger's.
And it's bled into our era. The Lugers, for those who are not familiar with Richard Luger, and you're more familiar now than you may have been before, he had been the mayor of Indianapolis. And we knew he would be our opponent long before the '74 campaign came around. So I was able to interview Luger for the book when I was doing the research for the Buy book. And I brought up the fact that how much we enjoyed the fact that he was known as Nixon's favorite mayor, because we were running in the Watergate year, and being Nixon's favorite mayor was not a plus. And he said, that was never true. He said that came from David Broder, who was a political reporter for the Washington Post, had written a column saying that Mayor Richard Luger is in and out of the White House so often these days, he must be Nixon's favorite mayor. And it stuck. And I told him, I said, well, we used it all the time. We could, and he says, yeah, I know you did. But then he said, near the end of Richard Nixon's life, he was at an event the last time he saw Richard Nixon. And they sat next to each other, and Nixon leaned over and said, you were my favorite mayor, which I think he enjoyed as well as I did. When John and I first started talking, he raised a really interesting point that really reflected on both of our lives. So that, I'd written a biography about a senator, and I wrote it while he was alive. He was able to read the first draft. He died before the book actually finally came out. John has had both experiences, writing about senators while they were alive, and in fact, in his case, while he was still in office, and then someone else, of course, who was deceased.
Yeah.
It's a very different experience, isn't it?
It is, and I will go into that. Maybe I'll talk about the Kennedy book and then kind of compare the two. But I want to make one other point about Senator Luger, which is, I mentioned statesman, and it's a quality that is in decline in American life. I think Senator Dole was a statesman. And it's, people since Aristotle have been debating what actually is a statesman or a stateswoman. There's no precise definition.
It's like, what is a giant of the Senate?
That would be. But I think that the fundamental question is, for a statesperson would be to say, the first question they say is, what is in the public interest? Then they say, what is in the party's interest? What is in my own personal interest? All three factors are in play. But I think the difference between a statesman and a politician is a statesman said, what is in the national interest? And that was the thing with Senator Luger. I always felt that even on issues that I would personally disagree with him, he really started out by saying, what is in the public interest? And I'm going to give you an example. In 1986, he challenged Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, on the issue of apartheid. He thought that the Republicans, the United States, needed to push harder on apartheid. So he broke with his own president. Fast forward 2010, he worked with Barack Obama, a Democratic president, on an arms control treaty. And it was a treaty that Luger told me later, he said, you know, if this exact treaty had been written by a Republican president, we would have had unanimous support by the Republican Party. He said the fact that it was President Obama meant that we had about 3 or 4 Republicans supporting it. Now the reverse has happened on the Democratic Party, and that's part of the problem that the Dole Institute is working on, the Simon Institute is working on, to get into a better politics where you just don't have this sort of relentless battle. But so I thought Senator Luger was a real statesman. And the other quality that I really admired was that there was a real strategic aspect to his work. And he once told me, he says, you know, as a senator, you can be very, very busy and get nothing done. You can spend all of your time going to meetings, answering roll calls. You're not accomplishing anything. You need to develop an expertise, and you need to focus on it. And in Luger's case, it was agriculture and foreign policy. And he worked really, really hard on these issues. He was willing to do the unglamorous work that is essential to getting things done. So, and it was bittersweet when the book came out. Within a few months, he was defeated, and I felt awful for him. I kept in touch with him. I would stop by his office a couple times a year, and we'd have good conversations about life and work. When I was a candidate for the Simon Institute, he wrote a recommendation for me, which was really amazing, and I was really touched by that. So but it was hard because I liked him a lot personally, and it's Bob, with Senator Bai. I mean, part of having a credible book is also to have a critical lens to it, and I think Senator Luger was really, really good on many issues. There was a couple issues where I think he wasn't as good as he could have been. I think with the Iraq War, he had lots
Find somebody where that's not true.
Pardon me?
Tell me somebody where that's not true.
Right. But for example, in the Iraq War, I think he had lots of reservations about whether the U.S. should invade Iraq. And if you knew Senator Luger and you listened to him and you knew Luger speak, when he would say, I'm not confident the administration has fully thought this through, that was Luger speak for saying they have not thought this through. And I'm really, really worried. But in this discourse that we have now, that message was not carried through. Let me quickly tell you my Biden story, and then I'll switch to JFK. So this is, as I said, I wanted, Senator Luger, for all of his many qualities, was not great at talking about himself. He was very modest, very kind of reluctant to talk about himself. So I needed some other voices. So one voice,
First
obviously.
of all, how rare is that in a politician in itself?
It's very rare. So one voice I needed to have was Joe Biden, who had been his companion on the Foreign Relations Committee for 30 years. So I reached out to then Vice President Biden and said, I'd like to do this interview through his press person, and said, could I do this interview about Senator Luger? They checked with the Luger people to make sure that this was a legitimate book, and it was, so they said, yep. And it was like one of these dilemmas. They said, we can have a 15-minute phone interview next week, or if you'll wait 6 weeks, we can give you 15 minutes face-to-face. Now, I had interviewed Senator Biden before, and I knew that once you had a face-to-face encounter with him, it wasn't going to last 15 minutes. And I thought, should I wait and just get a face-to-face meeting, or should, but then again, life happens, and maybe events, he becomes busy and he can't do it. So I said, okay, but I'll wait 6 weeks to have my one-on-one meeting with Joe Biden. His press person says, you have 15 minutes and I'm going to throw you out of there. I said, okay, I get it. So I go to the interview, and I'm in the White House press office, and they escort me up to his office. And he had seen me around the Capitol, many times over the years. So, but I don't know the name John Shaw Roy registered. But when I walked in, I walk into his office, and he's like, "Man, how you doing?" And he gives me a bro hug. How's it going? Yeah, and it's, let me show you around the office. So he's showing me pictures, and so this is the Vice President of the United States, and I'm from Peoria. So we sit down. And it was about 1:15, and he said, well, I'm settling in my chair. He says, "What'd you have for lunch?" And a hamburger. Hang on a second. So he literally reaches into his drawer, and he throws me a candy bar. And I'm catching it. My wife is here, and later on I told her, I said, "Joe Biden gave me a candy bar." She said, "What'd you do with it?" I said, "I ate it." I'm not going to keep it in my files, So he tosses me literally a candy bar. "What are you drinking?" And I said, So hang on. So he goes into his refrigerator, gives me a bottle of water. And then we settle into the interview. And now I have, his press person is just staring at me, and already we've lost 3 or 4 minutes. Yeah, she's just staring at me. And I tried to structure my questions so they're fairly tightly drawn so he was not going to just expand. So like the first one, I had a fairly tightly structured question, and he just was talking, and it was like 8 or 9 minutes. Got into another question, and he talked for 3 or 4 minutes, and I said, "Mr. Vice President, I know we need to be kind of winding this down." He said, "Oh no, I'm just starting." His press person shot me daggers. She looked at me because her whole schedule was gone. But he had these, this very kind of, and he had thought about this interview because he wanted to talk about Luger in a clear, honest way. He had mostly good things to say, but he also had some criticisms. So he had a kind of a list of talking points that he wanted to go through. So we had this, wide-ranging interview, but the one funny thing is I was trying to get a sense of what Luger's relationship was to the Senate Republican leadership. And I said, "Well, tell me a little bit about Senator Luger and Senator McConnell." He looks at me, and he reaches across, and he turns off my tape recorder. And he says, "Senator McConnell," and he goes to town. Don't think I'm at liberty to say what he said, but he goes to town, and then he reaches across, turns my tape recorder on, and says, "Senator McConnell can be a difficult senator to work with." So and he's turning my tape recorder on and off at various points. So finally, I'm like, I don't know what's on the record, what's off the record. My candy bar's gone. There's water over here.
If it's shut off, it's off the record.
Well, finally, I can hear some rumbling in his outer office, and about 4 or 5 people come storming in, and they say, "Mr. Vice President, President Obama needs to see you in 1 minute." And he's like, "Okay, I'm almost done."
Liars.
And so, it was a fun story, but the thing is, first of all, he had thought about the interview, he had taken it seriously, he had some interesting things to say, and I think it provided a more context and more kind of life and blood to just sort of a dry recitation of Senator Luger's record. So in any case, Senator Luger is someone that he passed away just 2 years ago. My wife
He actually passed away within a few weeks of Birch Bayh passing away,
Yeah.
which was, for us, just hard to believe. Because they become very friendly, which is also part of this whole story about what is different in the Senate.
Yeah.
Here are guys who had run against each other, ended up serving together and becoming close.
Yeah.
Which was
And
a
Senator
good,
Luger,
positive thing.
He was not a hater. He did not, he could disagree with people, but he did it civilly, politely, and he was a really intensely admirable person. And I think history is going to treat him very, very kindly. But then, interestingly, my book on Luger led to my book on Kennedy. And let me just kind of briefly tell you, and it will connect with a previous speaker of yours, Don Ritchie, because as I'm finishing up the Luger book, it's like, okay, so how do I put his career into context? How do I understand really, how to evaluate him? So I talked to Don Ritchie, the Senate historian. I said, well, so what can I read? How do I think about this? And he said, he gave me some things to read. He said, but what you really ought to do is look at a report that Senator John F. Kennedy developed on the 5 greatest senators in the Senate history. And I was sort of vaguely aware of it, but I pressed him a little bit. And he reminded me that Kennedy, when he was in the Senate, chaired this special committee that had actually been created by Lyndon Johnson, who then dropped it, to decide the 5 best senators in US history and to actually put their portraits up in a Senate reception room. And so this was, in some sense, the only project that JFK ever really did on his own in the Senate.
I wonder how many senators wanted their own pictures up there.
I think a lot of them, yeah, an awful lot of them.
Right.
So in any case, Richie said, but Kennedy put together this amazing report that you'll really want to look at to see how he evaluated senatorial greatness. And it was a really instructive, interesting report, and it helped me kind of come to an evaluation on Luger. So I sent in my Luger book. The next day, my wife and I went on vacation, and she said, okay, no more books for a while, okay? And I said, okay. So we go to the Eastern Shore of Maryland. First day on the vacation, she goes out to a thrift shop, and I'm sitting by the shores of the Chesapeake and looking out. I'm thinking, you know, there might be a way to write a short book on just this Kennedy committee, the Kennedy committee. And I was thinking of it, you know, JFK and the politics of history, because it became very politicized how these 5 senators were chosen. So in the course of about an hour, I sketched out what this book might look like. And I still have the little scratch paper in my desk. Went back to, you know, I hit it during vacation, so my wife would not see what I was up to. Came back to DC, wrote a proposal, sent it to an agent. He said, I like it. I think it's too narrow for a trade publication. So he said, let's expand it. So we expanded it to the book about JFK in the Senate. And for all that has been written about Kennedy, there really has not been much written about his Senate career. And it's interesting because, you know, I asked myself why. And I think there's a couple possible explanations. One, I think we assumed that it was just a stepping stone. You know, he was in the Senate for, he was elected in 52, served from 53 to 60, so almost 8 years in the Senate. And we tend to think it was just a stepping stone. It really wasn't consequential. I think also his life was so short that, you know, biographies just tend to focus on just the full arc as opposed to a Senate career. But then I sort of plunged into it about writing about Kennedy as a senator. And it was interesting. And Bob and I talked about this over breakfast. I'm not going to argue that JFK was this great, towering senator.
Yeah, he was not a giant of the Senate. He's a giant personality in our lives, but he was not a giant of the Senate.
He was not, and I think there's a couple reasons, and I think there's a couple maybe modern analogies that might help you think about this. I mean, first of all, Kennedy, let me just give you a little sense of his congressional career, because he served in Congress for 14 years. We don't think of him as a congressman, but he was there for 14 years. And 6 in the House, 8 in the Senate. But he was one of these people who was always thinking about the next thing, the next election. And no sooner than he was elected to the House and he was thinking about being a senator, and spent 4 years running effectively to run for the Senate. Then he gets to the Senate and he's thinking about, within a relatively short period of time, the next job, which was the presidency. And so I think Kennedy was one of these people with a lot of talent, incredible speaker, writer, but being a senator was not his ultimate passion. And Kennedy had maybe the misfortune, and actually I think there's an interesting analogy with Barack Obama, because Kennedy was in 1956, his career changed completely. He wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, which won a number of awards, a Pulitzer Prize. He was a rock star at the Democratic Convention, almost became the vice presidential nominee, was a Barack Obama kind of superstar of the party. And then the Democrat Adlai Stevenson lost in 56, and Kennedy had been on the campaign trail, and within a week or two after Stevenson lost in 56, he went on a family vacation over Thanksgiving, met with his father, and decided that he was running for president in 1960. So spent the next 4 years running for president, from 56 to 60. And he was, in a certain sense, the first modern candidate who spent 4 years running for the presidency. And, you know, it affected his performance in Congress, as you might expect. And Lyndon Johnson, who was then the Senate Majority Leader and was also aspiring to be president, was just very, very derisive about JFK and just thought he was a lightweight and he didn't have, you know, legislative skills and so forth. And so, so Kennedy found a way to use the Senate as kind of a launching pad for the presidency, but wasn't a hugely consequential senator. But the one question that Bob and I puzzled over in breakfast is, Kennedy barely won in 1960. What would have happened if he lost? He was still a young man, only 42, 43. Would he have done what his brother did? And I think Don Ritchie mentioned this. Ted Kennedy ran for president in 1980, lost, and then just decided he wanted to be a great senator and spent the next two and a half decades becoming one of the best senators in American history.
Becoming one of the leaders of the Senate.
Absolutely.
Talking about a giant of the Senate, Ted Kennedy was huge.
So would JFK have done that? Would he have just started to focus on a congressional career? And the one thing about when you research this period is, I went to the Kennedy Library and heard some tapes of Kennedy speaking, and early in January of 1960, so he's beginning this campaign, and he's talking to a reporter, and he says, "I don't know if this is going to work. Maybe I've reached my peak. Maybe I'm going to be no more than a senator. Maybe I just don't have what it takes to be president." And the thing is, when you hear the full story, and he gets elected in 1960 and becomes tragically killed several years later, but one of these giants in American history, you sort of think that his election was foreordained. And to hear him talking just on the eve of this campaign, saying, "I don't know if this is going to work out. I'm just going to give it my best." He wasn't cavalier. He's like, "I'm going to do everything I can." But there was this sense that nothing was certain and everything is contingent. So it's hard to know if Kennedy would have focused, if had he lost, on being a good lawmaker. I'm a little suspicious just because I think his temperament was very, very, he was an impatient person. Someone once said with JFK, when you're in a conversation with him, you should either educate him or amuse him, or he didn't have a lot of time for you. Others said when you talked to JFK, you got to the point quickly. He was not someone who liked a lot of stories and bantering. In many ways, his temperament, I think, was very, very much like Barack Obama's. And when I was actually working in the Senate, I had a chance to watch both Barack Obama and Ted Kennedy. And what was most striking, Ted Kennedy was the opposite.
Oh,
he was
a big Glenn Handler.
He would be, when he was on the floor of the
breeze.
Senate during a vote, he would be sitting in his desk, and by the end of the vote, half of the Senate would be gathered around his desk. He would be telling stories, laughing, joking. John McCain would be there. And it was just, he was the life of the party. He was this big, compelling, charismatic character. Whereas Senator Obama, later President Obama, was just, he was, smart, but he was a more detached, cool, distant personality. And when you read people who worked with JFK, that was his personality type. He was an introvert.
But I remember also with JFK, there was a lot of discussion about what he would do when he retired from the presidency, because he would also still be young. He would be 50, I guess.
Well, yeah, and that's, in fact, it created a little bit of tension in the Kennedy family, because some even joked, okay, because after he left Kennedy was elected president, there was a transitional senator, and then Ted Kennedy became the senator. And there was some joking in the family, okay, when JFK retires from the presidency, maybe he'll take, his old seat, which was now being held by his brother. So I think everyone chuckled except Ted when that was suggested, because Ted was beginning to like serving in the Senate. Although who knows, because Bobby Kennedy became the senator from New York.
But see, at that time, no one ever thought that was going to happen.
Right.
If the assassination hadn't happened, that probably wouldn't have happened. I think what's one of the interesting aspects of John Kennedy, as you and I discussed earlier, is that here he wrote Profiles in Courage, very terrific book, and it still rings out so many ways in our era, but he was not the most courageous of politicians. Here's somebody who wrote about courage in politicians, but when Joe McCarthy's censure vote came up, he was in the hospital with his back surgery, but didn't make his views publicly known. And when civil rights faced him as president, he didn't show a lot of courage really until well into his presidency. So I'm a fan, but I still find it an irony that he would write about Profiles in Courage, yet courage was not really his strong quality as president or senator.
And I would even say Kennedy was a cautious senator. And part of it, and this is, I think, an important point for you who are interested in politics, how different the parties were back then. And that was, the Democratic Party was a broad coalition of liberals, moderates, and conservatives. So was the Republican Party. And so liberal Democrats worked more closely with liberal Republicans than they did with conservative Democrats. So it wasn't like, red and blue America. I mean, there was a lot of back and forth occurring. And Kennedy was comfortable working in that kind of environment. I mean, he had good friends who were liberal Republicans. So it was a different era, and the parties were different. And frankly, I think we might be better off if we had two parties that were broad coalitions.
Less philosophical.
Less philosophical, less ideologically coherent, but it would just allow for just more free movement between the two parties. So it was different. But let me just make, I know we're going to go to questions in a second, but the one thing I've thought about, and I was mentioning this to Bob, is like, so I've written about a book about a senator who's alive and serving, and a senator who's been deceased. And I'm part of a biographers group, and there's a lot of discussion about, okay, so would you rather have your subject be alive and available for interviews, or would you prefer to have them deceased and having left good records, maybe still some people around who knew them? And so it's I think most people aspiring to write history would rather have a deceased subject, because the story is over. Hopefully you can assemble the records, you can develop a narrative, you need to find a way to enter into the story, but it's at least a settled thing for the most part. When it's a serving politician, it's very, very hard because their story is changing.
Suppose you'd learned about some big bombshell on Luger that he would have liked to have hidden. How would you have dealt with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we had an agreement that it was going to be an independent book.
Right.
So I was,
And it would have made your life very uncomfortable.
It would have been hard because, and I got to know Luger's staff well, and I liked them, and I got to know the senator really well, and met some of his family. So, and that's the other thing, there is this, when someone is alive, even if they are not literally looking over your shoulder, in some figurative sense they are. And you, as much as you battle it, you say, okay, if I write this about Senator Luger in the Iraq War, how is he going to like it? And I know that, we 7 years later or 4 years later, when we talking about the book, he said, I know you were pretty tough on me with Iraq, and I said, I called it as I saw it. And I mean, he wasn't trying to embarrass me or put me on the spot, but he had read it and had registered the criticism. So I guess the point I would make, for those of you who are interested in politics and even journalism, if you can shadow a senator or a governor or a congressman or a mayor or a city council member, do it. It just gives you a wonderful insight into the political process. And if you want to write about this person, I think you should, or do a documentary. I think it's harder to write a book about someone whose political career is continuing, just because the lag time with books is about a year. When you finish it, it comes to print, and the world can change.
Did you have concerns that when the book came out, you might affect his political career?
I did. And it did a little bit. I mean, his opponent, got a copy of the book and combed through it, and they actually jumped on some of the praises that Luger had received from Democrats, and he used that to say, we want a strong Republican. We don't want, Barack Obama's favorite Republican. So, I mean, I was worried that the book was going to be used, and I had hoped to have the book done a year or two before.
Yeah,
I changed publishers. It became difficult. I was working a full-time job. Bob and I are talking. It's really, really hard to write a book when you have a full-time job. But I was worried that the book would be used against him. But I think ultimately, the senator and I talked, after he left the Senate, and he would always thank me for doing the book, and he said that he really appreciated the fact that I spent the time to just try to understand his career and its full complexity. So
I think you entered into a very difficult environment. Having done it a little differently, I mean, my boss had been out of office for 30 years.
Yeah.
When I started writing about him. Now, he was still alive. He read the entire first draft. There were things that he would prefer not be part of the record, but they were in there. He never gave me a problem about it. My publisher at one point said to me, he was a little concerned because he said, I know you're sharing this with Birch Bayh, and I know that your relationship is such that that makes sense, but I warn you, people don't always like what is written about them while they're alive. It's a lot easier to write about somebody who's deceased, particularly if they're long deceased and they don't have any spouse or kids or, close friends still around. So mine was a little easier than yours. I think that's a real challenge to write a book about somebody while they're in office, and you might affect their career negatively.
Although I did have actually one really interesting interview with JFK in the Senate, because Harris Wofford, who was
not that you had an interview with JFK in the Senate.
I didn't have it with JFK, but so Senator Wofford was a young assistant for Senator Kennedy and then President Kennedy. Well, when I was writing this book, JFK in the Senate, Senator Wofford was now in his 90s and was still living and very sharp. And so I had a chance to interview him about working for Kennedy. And he told me one story that is just remarkable. So Kennedy had just won the Democratic nomination for president in late July of 1960. The Senate was going to be in session that next month for a special session for a couple weeks, so August of 1960. So Kennedy, who's the Democratic nominee, is there. Lyndon Johnson, who was his vice president, is the Senate Majority Leader, so he's at this session. Richard Nixon, who is president of the Senate as vice president, is there. So everyone is in Washington. They want to get on the campaign trail. So it's been this kind of cranky month, and Wofford is in Georgetown waiting for a bus to go to work. And a car pulls up, and it's JFK, his boss, the Democratic nominee for president, in a car with one security person saying, Wofford, what are you doing? He says, I'm going to work, Senator. He says, jump in. So he's in the car with Kennedy. There's no, huge motorcade. It's just one car. Kennedy's in with a driver and one security person. So they're driving to the Capitol, and he turns to, and Wofford, his expertise was civil rights. He says, Wofford, we have 10 minutes. Tell me everything I need to know about civil rights. Now, there's two ways to interpret that. One is, okay, come on, civil rights, 10 minutes, come on. But the other way, and the way Wofford interpreted it was, Kennedy did not want to waste a second. And he had 10 minutes in a car with his staffer, and, he'd been talking to him, but he had 10 uninterrupted minutes, and he was going to use it effectively and professionally, and was asking him some tough, questions about, what kind of legislation is moving, what are the impediments, what can be done through the executive branch, what should be done legislatively. So even though Kennedy was long deceased, there were still, some people around who had worked with him.
Harris Wofford was huge in the civil rights events that took place in the 60 campaign, particularly when Martin Luther King was jailed, and he wrote a letter to Coretta Scott King, which Daddy King then made a big speech about, and it helped him a lot with the African-American vote. But my guess would be when he asked him that question, he really wanted to know what he thought.
Yeah.
He didn't need to be educated on the issue. He wanted to know what, he respected him as a staff person, and I would say I've had that same perspective. He really wanted to know what you thought about it. And I like that too. And Harris Wofford was somebody you have to have a lot of respect for as well.
Yeah, and Wofford went on to become president of a university, Bryn Mawr, and then he became a senator from Pennsylvania. So went on to have a really distinguished career in his own right. So,
yeah.
So maybe I'll end here and then love to have your questions and comments. But so I do sometimes think about, when it comes to writing, what's better. I mean, you love to be able to talk to someone and interact and ask questions. So that provides some advantages. But for someone who has been, who has served, they're deceased, their record, their career is over. They've perhaps left, an archive that you can draw on. There's just a simplicity to that, and a distance and a detachment that probably makes it easier if you're writing a work of history. If you're covering a serving politician, it's probably easier to do journalism in that respect.
Well, I'd like to direct a different question at you, and then we'll be happy to turn over to the audience any questions you have, and anybody at home online who would like to ask a question, please submit your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. But we've talked about most of the subjects of your books, but not so much about Eisenhower. Also a Kansan, not a senator, but an important person in all of our lives, and an important person that you wrote about. So what did you learn, or what perspectives do you have about Eisenhower that are worth sharing?
You know, Dwight Eisenhower surprised me. You know, I came from a perspective, you know, growing up, I was, you know, like Bob was interested in the Kennedys.
I didn't grow up.
Pardon me?
I'm sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
You know, followed the Kennedys, was very interested in Kennedy, and sort of saw much of the political world from his perspective. And then I wrote a book on the Kennedy-Eisenhower transition, and I was just almost overwhelmed by how impressive Eisenhower is. I mean, if you see his press conferences, he's not a clear speaker. He's, he's stumbling.
Was that on purpose?
Well, it may have been, but the thing is, you know, you read some of his journal writing and his memoirs, and he's this amazingly good writer. He's clear, he's concise, he's vivid, tells wonderful stories. And so it was interesting to do this book on Kennedy and Eisenhower because it was almost out of Shakespeare. They were the two almost opposite archetypes. You know, Eisenhower was this, you know, five-star general, the guy who defeated Hitler, this towering figure in American life, you know, from the Midwest, tough, disciplined, stern. You know, Kennedy, liberal Democrat, young, from, you know, a wealthy family, Harvard educated. So they were these two wildly different personalities, but when it came to this transition, and they didn't really particularly like each other, but when it came to this transition, which was in the late 60s and 1961, they set aside their animosity and worked for the country to put together a smooth transition. And Eisenhower said on a couple occasions, you know, I don't love this guy. I wouldn't have voted for him. I didn't vote for him. But he is the president, and I need to do all that I can do to make sure that he is prepared to be the president. And Kennedy was a smart guy who read people well. And he saw that, you know, when he met with Eisenhower, he listened more than he spoke. He asked good questions. He was very respectful. And in some sense, Kennedy won Eisenhower over. And Eisenhower, at the end, became very surprised at how impressive he found Kennedy. So, but the one thing I will say about the Eisenhower Project, the Eisenhower, was that this was one time where I entered a research project with sort of one vague impression of someone. And then I saw, as I became exposed to more and more of the record, I realized what I had once believed really was not the full story. And that's, as you're doing research projects, always give yourself the opportunity to change your mind, because, you know, evidence and information and context sometimes allows you to see things differently. So
also the perspective of time.
Absolutely.
That helps. It helped me a lot. I learned things that I didn't know.
Well, and let me just maybe end with this. I mean, this book that I did on Kennedy and Eisenhower, my initial impulse was, well, let me tell you how this happened. So I was in a bookstore in Washington, and I just finished the Kennedy book, and I still had lots of stuff. And I sort of thought, okay, maybe I should try to do something with Kennedy. I don't really know what, but so I was at a bookstore in Washington, D.C., and I was browsing through an anthology of the greatest speeches in American history. And many of the speeches were separated by 5, 10, 15 years. And then I saw two speeches were separated by 3 days. And it was Eisenhower's farewell and Kennedy's inaugural. And so I'm thinking, in this bookstore, I'm thinking, so two of the greatest speeches in American history were separated by 3 days. How did people process it? You know, and the speeches were important because Eisenhower's farewell address was a fairly stern warning about stewardship, responsibility, about not getting overextended, running a government that was only as large as our tax base would provide. So it was kind of a stern...
And much of it is etched in stone in the new Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and I would encourage you to go to Abilene and spend some time there, because the Eisenhower...
I'm going tomorrow.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Bob is taking a road trip.
Yes, I am. I'm going tomorrow.
So
no snow this time.
Yeah.
You Kansans that keep bringing me bad weather.
So, but Eisenhower's farewell is kind of a stern warning. Kennedy's, you know, it's a Cold War. bear any burden, defeat any foe. I mean, it's this very exuberant, in some ways confrontational speech. So the thing was, it was like, okay, not only are there two of the greatest speeches in American history, separated by 3 days, but they sort of go against type. You have the conservative general talking about stewardship and responsibility and caution, and then you have the liberal Democrat having a very kind of hawkish, confront the Soviet Union at every place that we have to. So I started thinking about these two speeches. So I was literally on a metro in downtown DC going from this bookstore home. And the person sitting next to me must have thought I was totally crazy because I had a piece of paper like this. And for about 30 minutes, I was just writing down, and I sort of sketched out what a book might look like based on these two speeches. So I put it together and again took it to my agent who said, I like it, but again, that might be a little bit too geeky. So let's kind of recraft it and focus on this whole 10-week period in which of the Kennedy-Eisenhower transition, which is what I did. So that gave me a chance to really spend a lot of time with Eisenhower in terms of the archives and came away with this, deep respect.
Well, there's an Eisenhower story that I've never really read a good interpretation of. But if you think of how close the Kennedy-Nixon election was, the closest in our history at that time, Eisenhower had been asked during the campaign what were Nixon's greatest accomplishments as vice president. And he said, if you give me 2 weeks, I might have an answer for you. Now, that could have made a big difference in that election. And I never had I've never read any full good explanation as to why he would say such a negative thing about his own vice president.
I've heard, people wonder that. And I mean, part of it maybe with how I started out with Senator Dole. I think Eisenhower also had a sort of an acerbic sense of humor. I think he was at a press conference. He might have been annoyed at a reporter. And so rather than engaging, he just sort of snapped, I don't know, give me, 2 weeks and I'll think of something. Of course, people think that it revealed, some deeper thoughts he had about Nixon. And he was, he was ambivalent about Nixon. I mean, he did not think that he really grew into a significant leader during his 8 years as vice president. He wasn't sure that he really had the stuff to be the president. He thought he was better than Kennedy, but just barely. And so, so he did say something, and it did, and the Kennedy campaign pounced on that comment.
Of course, yeah.
And it became sort of the news that Nixon had to respond to.
So. In my interviews with Birch, one of the Birch Bayh's great accomplishments was the 25th Amendment, which provided a process for presidential disability and succession. Eisenhower came to testify. And they met first ahead of time. It was the only time he ever met Eisenhower. And he said it became clear Eisenhower had no idea what the amendment was about or anything. And by contrast, Nixon came and talked for 40 minutes about it without notes. And Birch said, I never expected to be so impressed by Richard Nixon. Because, he was like anybody else. In the 60 campaign, he was a Kennedy partisan, thought Nixon was the sleazeball and all this, and yet was totally impressed by him, but not by Eisenhower.
Wow.
He felt that Eisenhower didn't know what was going on when it came to something he was there to appear about.
And I do think I don't know the full story there, but I think Eisenhower, his health was not great during his presidency, and I think once he left the White House, he lived for another 8 years, but I don't think he was as much on top of his game as he had been as president. And there may have been some, who knows, maybe he was overcommitted and not really studied the issue.
I honestly don't know. And if he'd been Bob Dole, of course, we would have known it was a joke.
Yeah.
And it wasn't serious. All right, we're ready to take some questions now in our time remaining. Who's got a question? What a surprise.
What would you say Luger would say his greatest accomplishment in office was, and why?
I think he would say the Nunn-Luger Act was his greatest accomplishment, which helped secure the nuclear arsenal of the countries of the Soviet Union that were unraveling. And it helped secure thousands of nuclear weapons.
There were no protections.
Yeah.
They were just sitting there.
Yeah. And so, this was something that it wasn't popular. He got no immediate political results. It was hard work. And then he spent the next 20 years of his life he helped develop this landmark law, And then he spent the next 20 years overseeing it, traveling the world to make sure that it was being implemented. So it was an example of both doing a landmark bill and then making sure it works. And not many, the number of lawmakers who do landmark legislation is small, and the number who actually follow up and make sure that it works is vanishingly small.
And it was bipartisan.
And it was bipartisan, yeah.
Sam Nunn was a Democrat from Georgia.
Yeah. And for that, he was nominated several times for the Nobel Peace Prize, which I know he took great pride in that. And I think he also took pride in the fact that he was a statesman, that he was willing to work with Democrats when it was in the national interest, and he was willing to oppose his own party when it was, in the national interest. So I think he felt good about, he was proud of his service.
Well, the last couple of years of the Bai term in office, he was the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, which Luger was on. And he told me that when President Carter would share with him secrets that he was obligated by law to share with the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Carter would always say, "This is for you," and he would just say, "Thank you, Mr. President," rather than "okay," because he always felt he had to share it with certain members of the committee, but only members that he could trust, because he said we had certain members I will not name who, if I told them the secret, it would be in the New York Times the next day. But so he named 4 senators to me that he would share these secrets with on the Intelligence Committee, and one was Luger.
Yeah.
And that was it, to me, also impressive given their history.
That's right.
The fact that, but again, there was no animosity in the campaign. It was never a hatred. There was never somebody you had to beat him to save the country. We always ran against him because we wanted our boss to be reelected, not because we wanted Luger.
And just to point out, I mean, this was a different time in American politics, which I hope we can return to, in which, you have adversaries, you don't have enemies, and the other party is not an enemy. They have a different perspective on how the country can work. And so I think that was, it wasn't a perfect time, but I think there was that mentality that oftentimes pervaded.
Let me tell us, that reminds me of a story. In 1969, there was a nomination for the Supreme Court, a Nixon nominee, Judge Clement Haynsworth of South Carolina, and Birch Bayh led the opposition to the Haynsworth nomination. Haynsworth was defeated, and his chief sponsor in the Senate was Senator Marlowe Cook of Kentucky, Republican from Kentucky. And when the vote was over and we had won, Cook and Bayh are walking out of the Senate together, and Cook puts his arm around him and says, "Birch, let's find something you and I can work on together." And they did. His staff guy was Mitch McConnell. So it was a very different era. Another question, please.
Now that you've written 2 books about the careers of different senators, are there any senators, living or deceased, in mind that you would like to expand on their Senate careers in a book, maybe?
There is one that I am very interested in, is Phil Hart.
Oh, yeah, Phil Hart.
Who was this amazing statesman from Michigan who served from 58 to 76 and was, he blended.
One of the Senate buildings is named after him.
Yeah, he was universally respected, and he combined both amazing toughness, and he was apparently the nicest, sweetest human being in the world. And so he combined just a real kind of relentless toughness and principle with just the kindest and most gentle personality. Was a hero in World War II.
And was hospitalized with Bob Dole and Daniel Inouye in the same place.
Yeah.
And the building, that building is named after the 3 of them now.
Yeah. So he's someone that I'm interested in and would like to do more on.
That's when he's done writing my biography. It's just going to be a very short one, yes, very short. That's because I'm so young. Who else we have here got a question?
Okay, I can ask. This goes back to something you mentioned at the very beginning. When you were writing your book on the ambassador, what was one of the most interesting or remarkable, as you said, things that you learned about the diplomat?
Thank you for asking that, because let me tell you a second about that project, because it was really fun. So I wrote a lot of profiles of diplomats, and excuse me, typically I'd get about an hour with them. And I thought, and everyone's can be impressive for an hour. So I thought, what would it be like to just chronicle someone who's really, really good? What separates good ambassadors from great ambassadors? So I decided to write a book on what it takes to be a great ambassador. And I followed this man, Jan Eliasson, who was Sweden's ambassador to the US. And he was sort of Tom Brady on steroids. I mean, this guy was so good. And what was interesting is he was incredibly strategic. He had a long-term plan. But then he was also very, very detail-oriented. And even, let me give you a small example. I mean, he was one of these personalities. He was charismatic and fun. And he would have receptions. And one part of my job was I had an open invitation to go to receptions at the Swedish embassy.
Nice.
So they had this glamorous embassy. It's my job to go to these events. And I mean, they have amazing food and drink. And this guy he was an inveterate networker. And so you would go to his reception, and there'd be 4 or 5 Supreme Court justices there. And I'd watch him work the room, and it was just unbelievable how flawless he was. But then, I was even talking to him, I said, gosh, how do you do that? I mean, and he naturally remembered names, but he would, before hosting a party, he would spend about a half an hour in his private office going through the guest list. And he would study who was there, and then he'd think, okay, when did I see them last? What were we talking about? What were we working on? You know, what was his wife's name? Did they say something about one of his kids? I mean, he would literally prepare for a party. And so just things that seemed, and he did have a natural flair, but he also was just very, very attentive to detail. And he also had this kind of funny theory about diplomacy, and I think it maybe is true in politics. He says, in diplomacy, there is the art of the 45-second conversation. And he said, by that, I mean, when I'm hosting a reception and there's 100 people, I cannot go off in the corner and have a 10-minute conversation with everyone. I have to talk to everyone, and I have to have a meaningful exchange. So I have to be able to look someone in the eye and say, hey, Bill, you know, I remember we met at Brookings last week, and aren't we going to get together next week? And so you have a meaningful exchange. And then oftentimes, but we'll be talking next week. And so his theory was that you need to be able to engage people on a level that makes them feel respected and listened to and seen. But also, just given the requirements of the job, you cannot linger into long conversations. So he was, but it's a wonderful story because I wrote this book in 2004, and he was even saying, you know, I'm winding down. My career is about over. Well, since the book came out, he has been, he became president of the UN General Assembly, which is a 1-year rotating presidency. I'll just talk here. He became Sweden's foreign minister, which is effectively their Secretary of State. He became the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, the UN's Special Envoy to Darfur. And so he's had this amazing career. And I've actually been interviewing him about just the lessons he has learned in his career. And so this is where the world of Zoom provides opportunities. We've had some wonderful conversations about just what he has learned in his career, how diplomacy has changed, and just about leadership and statesmanship and the challenges the world is facing. And so I'm hoping to be able to do something with that project. So,
you know, it makes me think about all of these ambassadors that we appoint that are basically donors. Donors of the presidential campaign get ambassadorships often. And sometimes you get real professional diplomats, State Department types. How many bad ambassadors have you been exposed to that are
well,
really...
yeah, no one sends their mall developers to Washington. I mean, countries send their absolute best diplomats. So you have former prime ministers and foreign ministers and senior diplomats, just an astonishingly rich pool of talent. And as someone who covered the diplomatic scene in DC for many years, it really, really is remarkable to see some of these people, how they work, and particularly their language skills. I mean, like the ambassador, Jan Eliasson from Sweden, I mean, he speaks 5 languages. And he's correcting my English, you know, like I showed him like after the book had been published, you know, I sent him a draft, and he, you know, he sent me back his notes, and he liked the book basically, but he was saying, now here you're using the subjunctive tense in the you know, with a dependent clause. I mean, just these obscure things of English grammar, which I maybe had absorbed, but had not had remembered. But let me just say one other story about him, because this man, you know, has done everything in diplomacy. And he spent a number of years in his life trying to mediate the end of the Iran-Iraq war. He was part of a UN delegation. And he spent, in the course of this, about 25 hours in small group meetings with Saddam Hussein. And he said he'll never forget the time that, you know, they're in a kind of a tense negotiation, and he had to go to the presidential palace. And he says, you know, he's walking through the palace, and he said, I've never known what it's like to see utter fear on someone's eyes until I saw the people working in Saddam's, you know, presidential palace. Just this notion of just utter terror. So in any case, the ambassador is now in this negotiation with Saddam. And this is where kind of translation and interpretation gets complicated in international affairs, because so he's in this tense negotiation with Saddam, and Saddam speaks, and the interpreter says, you know, he wants you to go ahead with your speech. And Jan comes back, he says, I'm not here to give a speech. I'm here to, you know, to try to resolve a problem. Well, when he said that, the translator just froze, and she's like, I'm not going to tell that to him, you know. As it turned out, what Saddam basically was trying to say is, if you'd like to open, go forward, not let's hear your speech. So just that little semantic dynamic, because again, Jan says, yeah, I'm not interested in giving a speech, and he just saw the interpreter freeze, and he saw Saddam's eyes grow just icy cold, and then they were able to kind of get through that moment. I'll tell you one other just kind of final human story about his diplomacy is that, so he's in the midst of this amazingly difficult negotiation with Iran and Iraq, and they're in Geneva. He's negotiated all day. They're coming back the next morning for a tough negotiation. So he goes back to his hotel room, and he's like, okay, he says, I'm going to just turn on the news for 3 minutes, and then I'm going to bed. He turns on the news, and he's a Swedish diplomat, loves tennis, so he turns it on, and he'd lost track of the world, but it's the final of the US Open in which Mats Wilander, the Swede, was playing Ivan Lendl for the final. So Jan is bone tired. He's just spent, you know, intense hours in diplomacy. He said, all right, I'll watch one game. So he watches one game. Okay, I'll watch a second game. He ends up staying up all night watching what was then the longest U.S. Open final in history. And it was, you know, it was New York, so they were 6 hours behind Geneva. So, you know, it's still, you know, it's late at night in New York, but it's, you know, dead in the morning. So he basically spent, in the midst of this intense negotiation, he stayed up all night watching a tennis match. But it just shows kind of the human dimension. He goes to the negotiation, he said, I'm exhausted, you guys, but the Swede won last night, so that was good. So.
Okay, do we have any other questions then? So let me remind everybody that we have one more session as part of the Giants in the Senate discussion group, which is 2 weeks from today at 3 p.m. Kansas's own former Senator Nancy Landon Kasselbaum will be here with us. I hope you will join us at that time. Let's have a round of applause for John Shaw. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.